guest tonight is Dr. E. Michael Jones. Dr. Jones is a prolific writer and author of many books, including Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control, and the most recent Barron Medal, A History of Capitalism as a Conflict Between Labor and Usury. He's also the publisher of Culture Wars magazine. The subject of tonight's conversation is another book by Dr. Jones, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit and Its Impact on World History. It's quite an accomplishment. It's over 1,000 pages of text. The basic thesis is the tragedy of the Jewish people is their rejection of Logos, the rational, universal order personified in Jesus Christ. When the Jews rejected Jesus in favor of Barabbas, they chose revolution over the natural and rational order of the universe. This embrace of the revolutionary identity by the Jewish people has reverberated throughout history. We see it expressed in various subversive and revolutionary movements such as Freudianism and psychoanalysis, Bolshevism, feminism, gay rights, and neoconservatism. Dr. Jones, what motivated you to write this book?
There are two reasons. Daniel Jonah Goldhagen and the dishonest books that he wrote, especially the attack on Pius XII and the Catholic Church, which led me to ponder whether we had achieved anything as a result of Catholic-Jewish dialogue for 40 years after Vatican II. And secondly, the war in Iraq, where it became obvious, not just to me, but to a whole community out there, that the neoconservatives had gotten America into a war that had no benefit whatsoever for the United States under false pretenses. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and that there was nothing we could do to stop it. So here we had the latest Jewish revolutionary movement, namely neoconservatism, taking over Americans' foreign policy, wasting $1 trillion and thousands of American lives and probably hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. All the only plausible explanation would be for the benefit of the state of Israel. So that's what got me to write this book.
Now, in the beginning of the book, or the book starts with the persecution of Jesus Christ, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
Right.
And as I mentioned in the introduction, the decision by the Jewish people, their earlier leaders, to reject Christ as the Messiah, and what you argue is they chose a revolutionary path from that point on.
Right. Right.
You want to expand on that?
Well, as I said in the book, what are you rejecting? Just what are you rejecting? And we have to go back to the Gospel of St. John, the beginning of the Gospel of St. John. Ein arche, ein ha logos. In the beginning, there was logos. Now, it's always translated, in the beginning, there was the word. But that has no meaning. I mean, I guarantee you nobody understands that, because the word just does not convey the meaning that the Greek word logos does. If you look at the Greek English dictionary, you'll see that logos has about 5 pages of definitions in English, all the way from speech, word, language, discourse, rationality, all the way up to basically the order of the universe. The fact that the universe has an order is the result of logos. And so the second sentence takes this to its ultimate conclusion, which is basically kai logos ein theos. And logos was God. And that's the crucial point that the Jews reached when Jesus Christ became incarnate, when he was born. And so all of the promises that have been made to the Jewish people as God's chosen people were fulfilled. And the Jews turned on their Messiah. Now, here we have to define the word Jew. Okay, and I think, again, the best place to go is the Gospel of St. John. Again, he uses the word Jew 71 times. the Jews have never forgiven the Catholic Church for the Gospel of St. John. But basically, the important thing here is that he uses this as a category. This is important because, usually, as I said with logos, if it's a Greek word, it has some type of significance. And if we don't have the same word, oftentimes we lost the significance. Okay? So the Jew is problematic. He uses it repeatedly. It's clearly a category of importance. But it needs to be understood more precisely. And I think the best example of this is the parable of the man born blind. The parents of the man born blind refused to speak out of fear of the Jews, because the Jews threatened to expel from the synagogue anyone who accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Well, obviously, the parents of the man born blind were Jews, as was the man born blind. So why there's this fear of the Jews? Because the term Jew by that point had been redefined as what it is now to this day, namely the group of chosen people who rejected Jesus Christ. So those who accepted Jesus Christ were no longer referred to as Jews. Jew, from this point on, has a negative connotation. It also has the definition, as its definition, the rejecter of logos. And at that point, we have to unpack what the word logos means. As I said, it means the rejecter of rationality. Practical reason is morality. That means they reject morality. The rejecter of the order of the universe intended by God. The order of the universe includes the political order. What do you call someone who rejects the political order? You call them a revolutionary. And they fulfilled this role by not only calling for the death of Jesus Christ, for the Logos incarnate, but also asking for the release of Barabbas, who was a revolutionary. And my point here, the reason I began there, is that it's a turning point in human history. At this point, the straight line in salvation history is Abraham, Moses, Jesus Christ, the Catholic Church. And by the time the word Jew becomes a term, a category, these people are no longer children of Moses. They are no longer the descendants of Abraham. I mean, in some sense they are. We're all the descendants of Abraham. But they have taken a path. They are no longer the followers of that covenant that Moses had. They have become revolutionaries. And they will continue on this path. They have continued on this path to the present day. Whenever all these movements, the Jews become involved in these movements, they're invariably at the heart of every revolutionary movement in the West. Now, this is not me saying this. This is Rabbi Louis Israel Newman wrote a book on it. He said exactly the same thing. Heinrich Graetz, in his monumental history of the Jewish people, says the same thing. Basically every Jewish historian will say that yes, the Jews were revolutionaries, except they will, instead of saying revolutionary, they will say, well, they were progressive, or they supported progressive movements, or they were, one euphemism or another, but the basic word is revolutionary. From the time that Annas and Caiaphas asked Jesus Christ to come down from the cross, to the Obergefell decision of the Supreme Court ratifying gay marriage, the Jews have been involved in revolutionary activity and have been the avant-garde of every single revolutionary movement from then till now. That's basically the scope of the book.
the embrace of the revolutionary identity, signal or expressed in the rejection and persecution of Jesus Christ. Why was that decision taken by the Jewish people?
Because the Jews wanted a Messiah on their terms. It's very simple.
A political Messiah or military.
Yeah,
Messiah.
they wanted him to restore the kingdom. They wanted a mighty king like David. When he started talking about the way he did, he alienated. He basically disappointed the carnal hopes of the Jewish people. They wanted a carnal kingdom. They wanted a kingdom of this world. And Jesus had to remind them, my kingdom is not of this world. And that was the main confrontation. A Jew is a rejecter of Logos. He's a rejecter of Christ. That is his identity. He has a negative identity. It has nothing to do with his DNA. Anti-Semitism is based on some type of biological determinism. It was created in 1870 by a man named Wilhelm Marr in Germany in a book called Der Sieg des Judentums über das Christentum. Marr was a 48 revolutionary. He understood the traditional critique, European critique of Jews, which was religious, which is exactly what I'm saying here. Everything I'm saying is traditional Christianity, traditional Catholicism. Marr was an anti-religious revolutionary, just like Richard Wagner, who was also a 48er. And he wanted a new way of dealing with this, so he said, let's term this anti-Semitism. They are, and he played right into the biological determinism, the Darwinism of his era, and it created something that is in no way, shape, or form consonant with what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that
is the short explanation of why I am not an anti-Semite. Okay. I do not believe in biological determinism. I believe in freedom of the will. Okay, so here we have another strategy, Jewish strategy, the term anti-Semitism. What does it mean? I just told you what it means historically. It's obvious that I don't believe that. I'm saying it now. I've said it. You read the book. There's not a word in that book that can be used to justify that position because I don't hold it. So what does anti-Semitism mean now? I mean, the joke that Joe Sobran used to tell was an anti-Semite used to be someone who didn't like Jews. Now an anti-Semite is someone Jews don't like.
Yeah.
Now that comes close.
Yeah.
That comes close. That's pretty much a fair estimation of what the word anti-Semite means today. But I feel the definition is basically an anti-Semite is someone who criticizes Jews.
Yeah, in your introduction, you write, calling a Jew may or may not be prima facie evidence of anti-Semitism, but criticizing a group of people as Jews is regularly taken as such evidence. This is because it indicates that the group exists, that it has definable beliefs, at least in many contexts, and that it can, therefore, act in a certain way and can be criticized for so acting.
Right.
So it's behavior, not genetic makeup.
Absolutely. And the will is free. You know, these people were created by God with their free will, just like everyone else. Okay? So all I'm doing is holding them accountable for their actions.
Basically, it's the content of their character or behavior as opposed to color of their skin or, what.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we don't talk about the color of the skin in this instance.
Yeah,
we do talk about DNA, and it's the same type of biological determinism. So no, the Jew is not biologically determined to do anything, nothing. And there are people who say they're not even Semites if we're talking about the Ashkenaz. Mm-hmm. This is the point of Shlomo Sand in his book. So it's totally irrelevant. The Jew will. The Jew will be a revolutionary as long as he perdures in this rejection of Logos. And the fact that they have perdured to this day, I think is perfectly evident. And that's why I went from the crucifixion up to whatever I ended on, neoconservatism.
Now, Jesus Christ himself predicted the destruction of the temple, and the Jews had their revolution, and the Romans destroyed the temple. And that revolution failed. It was Simon Bar Kokhba, the failed Messiah.
Yeah, there were two revolutions, one in 70, and then Simon Bar Kokhba came again in 135.
Okay, so it's basically a 60-year process. They're dispersed. This is the diaspora.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
They lose the temple. The temple's destroyed, and this is where you write about the distinction between Old Testament or biblical Judaism and Talmudic Judaism.
Right.
Want to expand on that?
Yeah, Judaism is a religion. As a religion, it is newer than Christianity. It came after Christianity, because the religion of Moses, the Torah, that is the basis for Christianity. The Jews during the second revolution, the one that led by Simon Bar Kokhba. Now wait a minute. Am I confusing revolutions here? Anyway, one of the rabbis there had himself smuggled out of Jerusalem in a shroud during the siege because he understood which way it was going. And he went to the German general and he said, asked him for a favor, and the favor was, I would like to start a school. This is the beginning of Judaism. Now, I'm confusing the two. Was that 70 or was that 135?
If I recall, it was 130 A.D.
Yeah, okay. So that's the one I'm talking about.
Yeah.
This is the beginning of modern Judaism because the Judaism of the Old Testament simply did not exist anymore. You need three things. You need a priesthood, you need sacrifice, and you need a temple. They were all destroyed. The Romans destroyed them because the Jews rose up in revolution. This was the full manifestation of their rejection of Jesus Christ. Took a couple of decades, but eventually it came about. And the Romans came in and obliterated any possibility of the traditional Jewish religion. There's no priesthood, there's no temple, and there's no sacrifice. Of course, the Catholic Church now has the priesthood, the temple, and the sacrifice. So this is proof that they are the true children of Moses, the real fulfillment of the promises, and not the Jews. What they got was a debating society. It was called a synagogue, which is not a temple. And the debating back and forth between the rabbis eventually got codified as the Talmud. It took a couple hundred years. There are two Talmuds, the Palestinian Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud finally got written down around 600 A.D. This, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, is the heart of the Jewish people. This is the new religion. It's not the religion of Moses. It's the antithesis of the religion of Moses. Whatever the Torah forbids, the Talmud permits. This is just a saying, a rabbinic saying. And so that's what you have as the new Jewish religion. The point of this new Jewish religion is to keep Jews from Jesus Christ. It's that simple. All of the elaborate, and the Talmud is full of blasphemies and fear-mongering just to warn Jews to stay away from Jesus Christ. And basically, when it became apparent that the Christians were going to have to take over the empire and the administration of what used to be the Roman Empire, they had to come up with a plan of dealing with the Jews. And it was Sicut Judaeus Non. Two parts, basically. On the one hand, no one is allowed to harm the Jew. That means you can't disrupt his religious services, you can't desecrate his cemeteries, none of that stuff will be permitted by the Christian ruler. On the other hand, the Jew who is tolerated has no right to undermine either the faith or the morals of the Christian population. Now, I think this was a very successful modus vivendi, a way of having these two groups who are at fundamental odds with each other and will never be reconciled until one converts or the other disappears. It's just never they will never be reconciled. The church understands this. The church understands there's some type of deep theological significance to the fact that these Jews continue. And so they just say, this is the political modus vivendi that we worked out in dealing with them.
Now, when the church discovered the Talmud, it was Pope Gregory the Sixth.
No, the ninth.
I'm sorry, the ninth. Pope Gregory the Ninth. And I think it was someone mentioned the Talmud to him. He said, "What's the Talmud?"
Yeah. There was, first of all, in every age, there's always a number of Jews who see the light and then convert to Christianity. There are always Jews everywhere who understand that Logos is their destiny. Okay, and some take it, just they find the truth in some area and then they testify to it, and in that sense they are conforming to Logos. Some go all the way and accept Jesus Christ as the incarnate Logos. By the middle of the 15th century, let's go to the middle of it, the officials in Rome were just trying to do, what do we do with all these synagogues? All the Jews have abandoned the synagogues. There wasn't a Jew left in Western Europe. The Jews had either converted to Christianity or they had migrated to places like Poland. They had gone east. So it was a very successful evangelization campaign. As a matter of fact, it was too successful, you'd have to say. Too many Jews converted for, convenience sake. It got to be such a mass movement that it swept up a lot of Jews that you'd have to say were not sincere in their conversion, and that led to the Converso crisis in Spain.
And that kind of, I guess, sets the table, at least establishes within Jewish culture the idea of being, subversive or disingenuous? Or
Well, the problem here is there is a fundamental difference in the attitude toward either, whatever you want to call it, conversion or persecution. Mm-hmm. It was made very clear to Christians that they could not offer up incense to the idols to Caesar in Rome, that they would have to die first, and this is precisely what they did. There were large numbers of Christian martyrs in places like the Colosseum and so on and so forth, and they were told they had to die before they would renounce their faith. Well, the Jews took the exact opposite course, and the rabbis condoned insincere conversion. They have terms for it that are in the book, which I have forgotten, but basically the rabbis, if your life was threatened, you could dissimulate and you could pretend that you converted. Now, this was a catastrophe for the Jewish people because at this point you feel you can't trust the Jews. How can you trust the Jews? If they're willing to lie to you about something as fundamental as whether they believe in God or not, or their faith, then how can you trust them on anything? And this, of course, as I said, this prepared the way for the Converso crisis. Because at a certain point, it became clear that the Jews were not following the new religion. They were still taking usury on loans, for example. This was forbidden to Christians. They were still taking usury on loans. They were not sincere. They were conniving with the Moors, which was a big issue in Spain, because the Reconquista was underway at that time. And so at a certain point, the Queen Isabella decided she needed help, and so she brought the Dominicans in to conduct the Inquisition. That no Jew died during the Inquisition. It didn't affect Jews. The only people who were subjected to the Inquisition were Christians, in particular Jews who had converted. And if they converted and they were not sincere, or they were found to be guilty of backsliding, they were warned. And if they persisted, they ended up being burned at the stake. But that was Christians, and that was the church exercising discipline over its own people. No Jew ever was subjected to the Inquisition.
But this idea of, or the concept of the conversos, what it does is it creates the suspicion of the enemy within.
It's one of the ugliest chapters in the history of Christianity, because it calls into question the sincerity of the convert. And also it calls for, once the Spaniards start turning to a form of racism, limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Well, that's not a Christian concept. Sorry, blood is not part of the Christian belief. Once during the Middle Ages, there would be pogroms in German cities, largely because of the behavior of the Jews, largely because of usury. The Jew, if he ran to the cathedral and accepted baptism, he'd walk out and nobody would touch him. That is, in a sense, the Christian, that is the Catholic belief. That is the belief of the Catholic Church. And it's obviously, it makes sense, because if Judaism is this negative identity, if all it is rejection of Christ, then once you reject the rejection, that's the end of the story. You're one of us. And that's the way they were treated. The thing that threatened that was the Converso crisis, where you had large numbers of Jews just swept along, sort of like in the wake of this huge ship of conversion. All kinds of Jews are swept up in the enthusiasm for this, and some of them are not sincere. And you've got basically now a war of reconquest, and you've got the Jews as a fifth column conniving with the Moors. And they can't tolerate that, so they have to weed them out. And how do you find out? Well, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to do that. And so you ended up with the Inquisition. And in the end, the Inquisition didn't solve their problem anyway. And so in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Jews from Spain. Couldn't deal with it, couldn't solve the problem, and so they just expelled them. Now, these were not conversos. These were Jews that were expelled. And the conversos stayed, and some of them, became great saints in the church. Others, well, they were opportunists. Tried to make the best of both worlds here.
They couldn't distinguish between those, so basically they decided just to rid themselves of the problem.
They decided thought they could expel the Jews, and everyone applauded them for expelling the Jews, including Pope Alexander VI, who was a Borgia, who was a Spaniard. Of course, he's not the greatest pope in history, but I mean, it was generally seen as a necessary measure to be taken there in Spain. Problem here is, of course, that now you export the problem. And so now you have two main places where the Jews go. One is to Turkey, where they start working with the Sultan for the overthrow of Christendom. The other place is Holland, where they become the fifth column that will eventually lead to the foundation of the Dutch Republic and capitalism.
And it was the Dutch Jews, Amsterdam Jews, which were integral to the success of Cromwell and the beheading of Charles I?
That's right. That's right. The English, Barbara Tuchman has written a book about English philo-Semitism. She traces it back way before I think it began, but I think once you had the Protestant takeover of England, the alliance with the Jews was just natural. It just had to happen. One way or the other, it was going to happen. Because what you had was a conversion to basically Jewish thinking, Jewish behavior, namely usury. This is what happened as soon as the Catholic Church was removed as an authority in England.
You've referred to the Protestant Reformation, the English Reformation, as pretty much a looting project, a plunder operation.
Yes.
And this semi relates to usury and the Jews.
Yes.
Can you explain the connection there?
All right. In a sense, there are two books here. Basically, the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit was the first volume, and then Baron Metal is the second volume. Because Baron Metal is a history of capitalism, and the history of capitalism is bound up with the Jews as well. It's sort of there are these paradigms when the famous French novelist, whose name escapes me at this point, he's in Paris, and he sees Heinrich Heine and James Rothschild walking arm in arm.
Is it Balzac?
Balzac, that's right. Yeah. He says, "Voilà tout l'esprit juif." In other words, this is the whole waterfront here. You got the Jewish revolutionary at the bottom and the Jewish financier at the top. And between the two of them, that's how they're going to take over the world. So that you find this dyad at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution with people like Trotsky and Jacob Schiff. the New York Jews were big promoters, supporters of the Russian Revolution. It doesn't make any sense according to a Marxist class analysis, but it does make sense according to this Jewish solidarity and the Jewish attack on Logos. So this is what you happened. You had the outbreak of revolution, the revolutionary spirit among the Hussites in Bohemia, Prague, in the beginning of the 15th century. The Jews were heavily involved in supporting this. Prague has always been a Jewish city. It was a major trading post for slaves, and the Jews were always had a prominent position in that city. They started supporting the Hussites against the Catholic Church, and the Hussites then began to take on this identity. When you repudiate the authority of the Catholic Church, when you repudiate the state upon which the church is founded, the church, I mean, being allied with the state, where do you go? Well, you go to the Old Testament, and you start to talk about yourself as an Old Testament prophet, and which is what the Hussites did. These were Catholic priests who were sick to death of following the monastic, the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And when it comes to the priest, chastity was just especially onerous. And so these priests wanted to live a carnal life, and so they repudiated the monastic life, and they started acting like Old Testament prophets. And why did they do that? Well, because the Old Testament prophets had many wives. And any guy who's going to start a religion will make polygamy normative in that religion. This was the beginning of the revolution. It found its fulfillment 100 years later in the Reformation. Thomas Müntzer, one of the leading lights of the Reformation, went down to Prague and imbibed this Hussite Judaizing spirit and brought it back to Germany, and then the Reformation began. There were two causes of the Reformation: lust and greed. That's it. All of the theological stuff came after the fact. This is especially true in England. There is no theological justification whatsoever for any of this type of stuff. It was in someone like Henry VIII, you had lust and greed combined in one monstrous package there. Okay, but in Germany, you had a sort of division of labor. The lust department was led by Luther. Luther was a priest similar to the ones I just described who were part of the Hussite rebellion. He was a man who had serious problems controlling his passions, whatever they were: anger, gluttony. He was a heavy drinker, and he could not control the sexual passion either. At a certain point, he just gave up, and the Reformation was notorious. The reformers were notorious for raiding convents and carrying the women off and auctioning them off to various people. Luther, at a certain point, could not resist this, and he married a nun by the name of Katharina von Bora. Her nickname was Käthe in German, and he used to call her Kette, which is the German word for chain. At this time, he wrote The Enslaved Will, and so justified his lack of control of passion with some type of theological reasoning or lack of reason, justification. That's in order to be successful, he had to bring the princes in, and the German princes were no slackers when it came to lust. If we take Philip of Hesse as an example, but their main motivation was greed. They wanted to steal church property, and that was the deal known as the Reformation. The clergy got to marry. They got to marry nuns, and in exchange for the property they gave to the princes, they became the established church. That is the deal in England, in Scotland, in Germany, and Scandinavia. That is the Reformation deal, and all of the theological stuff is after the fact. It's all after the fact, including in Luther. The great R.H. Tawney wrote a book called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. in which he said, great sense. So the book is completely wrong because it tries to find a theological justification, a change in theology. There is no change in theology. They can't find it. But anyway, he has this great sentence there where he says, the upstart clergy had their teeth in the carcass, and they weren't going to be whipped off by a sermon.
Now, you were talking about the Jewish revolutionary spirit, and let's talk about a few of these revolutionary movements throughout history that, I mean, one thing you write much about in the book is Freemasonry. And,
right.
And what I take from understanding Freemasonry is it's sort of a technology that's used to subvert and divide and conquer for the purposes of empire. That's why the British used it so effectively. Of course, the Jewish Freemasonry, we think of B'nai B'rith.
Right.
Other examples is some of the movements throughout history. I mentioned in the beginning was psychoanalysis.
Right.
Boaz anthropology.
Right.
Now we have deconstructionism.
Absolutely. Literary criticism as well.
Economics. You mentioned Milton Friedman.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And of course, what I got one of the most, I guess, one of the most interesting parts, entertaining parts of the book was your part on basically the takeover of culture by Jews. Jewish humor, like characters like Mel Brooks and Woody Allen. That
right.
Yep. It's a lot there, but what I got from that is basically what you did. The Freudianism of psychoanalysis, even with Boaz and anthropology, his student was Margaret Mead. It's pushing the notion of sexual repression as the cause of neurosis, and the way to cure that is through sexual liberation. And this is a black operation against society's norms, values, and morality. Is that a good summation?
That's right.
Okay.
The crucial Jew in this regard is Wilhelm Reich.
Okay.
Who wrote The Mass Psychology of Fascism in the 1930s. Reich was a Jew. He was a Freudian and a Marxist, but found that it was much easier to mobilize people if you used sex, and that's what he did. Mm-hmm. And he became the patron saint of the sexual revolutionaries in the United States. He appeared on the cover of the New York Times magazine in 1970. In the 1968 revolution in Paris, they threw his book at the police, literally. Copies of his book.
This is the Mass Psychology of Fascism?
The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which is the seminal work of how you use sexual liberation as a form of political control. And it was a Jew who came up with it, basing it on basically Jewish Bolshevism, a combination of Jewish Bolshevism and Jewish psychology, specifically Sigmund Freud. He had studied under Sigmund Freud in Vienna.
It's dethroning reason and enthroning passion.
Right.
Yeah.
It's turning the world upside down.
Yeah.
So the classical picture of the soul is logos, ethos, pathos, reason, will, passion. Well, now you put passion at the top, and then you overthrow the king, and then you do whatever you want, except that the people who know what they're doing take passion and then turn you into its slave, and then they rule you. And that is in a sense the Masonic way to rule the world, through covert means, and that's the world we live in today. Absolutely.
Well, this is the language of liberty that they enslaved.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's why we have the New York Times recently attacked Poland, because they weren't defending sexual freedom. And they were also backsliding on free market economics. Well, there you have it. The Times is finally articulating the real regime here. It's sodomy and usury. You begin with sexual liberation. You benumb and befuddle and cloud the mind of the people with passion. And then once they're completely helpless, the usurers roll in and enslave everybody. And that is the story of the 1970s in America in a nutshell. What began with the decriminalization of abortion ended with the decriminalization of the usury laws. And
this is also what you get is, you got this with Freudianism, I guess, but the whole agenda is sort of this transvaluation.
That term comes from Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
But Freud was a Nietzschean. Part of what I talk about is he basically covered his tracks. He got all his ideas from Nietzsche, including the Oedipus complex. It's in The Birth of Tragedy.
Now we have, of course, the Frankfurt School in cultural Marxism, and they go to universities in Hollywood, basically media and education, right?
Right. So
they also go to work for the CIA, which is interesting.
Yes.
Herbert Marcuse.
Herbert Marcuse was all of those things.
The rise of the Frankfurt School and it's sort of its takeover of academia. I guess the context of that is the post-war era, the GI Bill, and they sort of were able to get into these universities just when the university was expanding rapidly.
Absolutely. There was a tremendous demand for professors during this period of time. Huge build-out of the universities. And the Jews were now cultural heroes because the Nazis had been defeated. The Nazis didn't like them. And whatever the Nazis didn't like became good in the period following the war. Schoenberg's music being a good example of what the Nazis didn't like now becoming good.
And you had, of course, Theodore Adorno's The Authoritarian Personality, which targets, I guess, traditional family, right?
Absolutely. This was a project of the American Jewish Committee, and it was their attack on Catholicism, basically. And simultaneous with that, we had the attack on ethnic neighborhoods, which was orchestrated by Louis Wirth, another Jew.
Out of the University of Chicago, correct?
At the University of Chicago. He was the architect of the social engineering of the 1950s. One of the authors of Gunnar Myrdal's book, The American Dilemma, which was basically the program set out by the psychological warfare establishment about how they were going to socially engineer the United States after the war.
That was to homogenize the country, to facilitate the American century.
Right. Basically, you wanted to break down any type of ethnic allegiance and destroy these Catholic ethnic enclaves because they were just too powerful politically.
And this is where Hollywood gets in the game because that was instrumental in imposing the production code.
Well, that was a little bit earlier. I mean, basically, once the Jews arrived in America in large numbers from, let's say, the 1890s, the beginning of the first decade of the 20th century. And they were always interested in new technologies, and one of the new technologies at the time was the motion picture. So basically, they stole it from Thomas Edison, moved out to Hollywood, and started producing films. Within a couple of years, by the middle of the 1920s, the entire country was outraged at this Jewish assault on their moral sensibility. You can get the book out. You can look at it, pre-code films. The same thing that happened later, but basically nudity, ridicule of the clergy, promotion of homosexuality, all this type of stuff was going on at this point. Largely, some of it, obviously, for money, sex sells, but there was always a subversive element to it. And the Protestants tried to deal with it, and they failed. The Hayes Commission failed. And at that point, the Catholics stepped up to the plate. The Catholic bishops stepped up to the plate. And they basically told Hollywood was in a bad way at this point because in 1929 they borrowed a lot of money to finance talking pictures, and their main source of funds was an Italian Catholic, Antonini, who was the head of the Bank of America, and he just said, "We're not going to lend you any more money." That put them under a lot of pressure. And then at the same time, Cardinal Doherty of Philadelphia called for a boycott of theaters, all movie theaters in Philadelphia, and Harry Warner's losing $100,000 a week in Philadelphia. The Catholics were threatening to spread that boycott to every big city in the country, and at that point, the Jews caved in. And they allowed them to create the production code, which said no nudity, no blasphemy, no ridicule of the clergy, and a lot of other stuff just for purely American sensibilities. And so for 31 years, that was the rule in Hollywood. By the way, the Coen brothers' new film deals with, Hail Caesar deals with this. It's 1951. It deals with a lot of these themes.
Yes, I saw that.
Kind of like the Catholic controllers of Hollywood there, and how the Jews, who were mostly communists at that point, how they felt about this, and so on and so forth. But that continued until 1965 when the Jews broke the code with a movie called The Pawnbroker, which was a Holocaust movie. But it was a Holocaust movie.
Which put it beyond criticism, I guess, right?
Yes, because then you got to smuggle tits into the movie and nobody could object. Mm-hmm. So basically, the black prostitute takes off her shirt, their bare breasts, and they break the code. And at that point, the Catholics should have called for a boycott, but they had lost their nerve and they didn't. Largely because of the Second Vatican Council. They had just passed Nostra Aetate, which, said that we were against anti-Semitism. And isn't it anti-Semitic to say that Hollywood's run by Jews? Doesn't that qualify you as an anti-Semite? Unless you're Neil Gabler, of course, who's a Jew who wrote a book, An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Created Hollywood. Then it's okay. But if you say it, you're an anti-Semite. So this is a double standard that we now have to live under, largely because the Catholic Church ran up the white flag in the culture wars in 1965.
That was after Vatican II at Nostra Aetate?
Came out in 65. That's the year that I did this in fair amount of detail because I was doing the biography of Cardinal Kroll, and I had access to all of the Legion of Decency archives when Kroll was the head of it. And basically, it was Eli Landau writing to Monsignor Little, who was head of the Legion of Decency at the time, saying, this is going to be a new era of cinematic art. And Monsignor Little said, no, it's the thin end of the wedge. We know what you're doing. And then he said, this was really interesting. He said, the shot that you did there with Rod Steiger as the pawnbroker, the shot was basically a kind of awkward shot. Because basically you have the woman bearing her breast. It's really not part of the scene. It's kind of spliced in there. So Monsignor Little said, I have a better idea for you. Shoot the shot from the back. So the back of the black prostitute, and that way you get Rod Steiger's face in the frame. So it's a much more sophisticated scene if you do it that. Well, they didn't want to do that because the whole point of the movie is to get tits into the movies. Because they're losing out to television. And they could never do it in television, so now you can go to the movies and see what you can. And it's cheaper than rebuilding the Coliseum, which is what they had to do for Ben-Hur.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, then a few years later, they're, like The Godfather has it for no particular reason. It's just a gratuitous shot.
Yeah, there are lots of gratuitous. Like, there's a great film of Al Pacino in The Merchant of Venice, which would be great to show in classrooms, except they have to have, tits in the movie. Why'd they have to do that?
Yeah, they ruined it, yeah.
They had to ruin it. So I'd love to show this movie when I go to Iran, but now I can't do it because I don't know how to edit. I can't edit the thing. It just ruined it.
Mm-hmm. But I guess whether it's to titillate, to get more people into the theaters, or to corrupt, which probably is the...
Or make money, and there's no way to draw a line between all those things. It's all of the above. It's all of the above.
Now, we're getting into the 70s, and, of course, we have the neoconservative, which is another revolution. It's neoconservatism, whether it's communism, Trotskyism. It seems like there's no real love for any particular ideology. It seems to be just as long as it's revolutionary or disruptive.
Well, I mean, the neoconservatism was one of the great mystifications of modern political life. The term was created by Irving Kristol, who was a Trotskyite in the 1930s at Alcove B, the famous Alcove B in the city community college in New York. So he was a Trotskyite, and then his son Bill is a conservative because he's following. Irving Kristol said a neoconservative is a liberal who is mugged by reality. That's mystification. Mm-hmm. If you examine the beliefs of Trotsky and the beliefs of the neoconservatives, they're pretty much the same. Perpetual war, the domination of one class, not the proletariat, but the middle class, and a kind of aggressive foreign policy that has this messianic desire to spread this system throughout the world. Except now it's not the Soviet system, it's the American system. So it's pretty much the same thing. And what happened is that America became the evil empire over this period of time. Soviet Union collapsed, and because of this Jewish takeover of our culture, we have the same basically aggressive kind of Bolshevistic foreign policy that the Soviet Union had. So this was this mystification that had to be deciphered. That's what I'm saying. Because if you look at it according to political categories, you'll never understand what's going on. Because they're conservative. No, the common denominator here is they're Jews. And the Jews have this penchant for revolutionary activity for the reasons I've already explained. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand the dynamic of history, certainly not recent history. So as part of this, I talk about the Jews get involved with turning the Negroes into revolutionaries. The Black Jewish Alliance lasted for 70 years, from the founding of the NAACP to maybe 60 years to Harold Cruz's book. I pronounced it dead, with Harold Cruz's book, but it's now come back. It's in Ferguson. Who's supporting Ferguson and Black Lives Matter? Who's supporting them?
George Soros.
George Soros. Everybody knows this now. It's the resurrection of the Black Jewish Alliance. Same type of thing. The Jews are using their money to stir up revolution among proxy warriors. Now, the other group of proxy warriors is, of course, the homosexuals. And except for this recent rebirth of Black Lives Matter, it's been the homosexuals who have been the avant-garde of the revolutionary movement. And in a sense, that's what we're seeing today, right now. Right now. Beginning a year ago in Indiana, it was the CEOs and the homosexuals who basically overturned the rule of law in Indiana. Got the legislature, they have veto power over state legislatures. State legislatures are the weak link in this political chain. And the CEOs and the oligarchs, let's put it this way. Let's use the term oligarch. What do we mean by oligarch? The group of minorities, the CEOs, the 1% economically, the homosexuals, who are also 1%, and the Jews, who are also around 1%. What do they have in common? They're always minorities, and they have lots of wealth and power and control over the media. And that's precisely what we're seeing now. They have so much power now that they can veto state legislatures across the country. So a year after Indiana, we have Georgia. Exactly the same story, exactly the same people.
Have you
parachutes into Athens and says, hello?
Yes.
The CEO of Salesforce goes to Georgia and threatens the state legislature. We're going to boycott you. And then the state of Georgia caves in when the NFL gets involved and threatens a boycott of their stadium. Same thing in North Carolina, same thing in Mississippi. So once again, here we are. It's the middle of one more revolutionary movement, and the Jews are intimately involved. So if you say the Jews are behind gay marriage, they will call you an anti-Semite. But Joe Biden says it, and it's okay. And then the lady, I forget her name, writes an article in Tikkun after Obergefell, and she brags about how the Jews defeated the Manhattan Declaration and beat everyone and were instrumental in establishing it. And that's okay, because they're proud. That's the situation we're in right now.
This is the cultural subversion, cultural aggression that you write about.
Yes, yeah. And homosexual marriage is obviously a form of subversion. Do you think homosexuals can get married? Do you think two men can marry each other?
Not if marriage means anything.
No. Of course not.
Changing reality. Well, that's
so all you're doing is subverting the meaning of marriage, because you want to subvert any institution that allows people to have some type of independence from the oligarchs.
And this gets into this sort of this passion over reason, individual over the community, this sort of atomistic attitude towards how society should function. It's a divide and conquer strategy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it weakens, I guess, it weakens the host society at the to benefit a certain minority.
Right. The fundamental problem here is from the beginning of the United States, the creditor is the man with all the money and all the power. How does he force his will on the majority of people when you claim that the country is a democracy. That's the fundamental. That's what we're seeing with the presidential campaign as well. This is why the Republican Party is upset with Donald Trump, because the Republican Party is run by oligarchs, people with big money, Sheldon Adelson. And Trump seems to be one of them, but he's making noises that he's not one of them, and apparently they can't control him. At one point he told the Jews, "I don't want your money." And then he undid it all by that stupid appearance at IPAC. So he's like the broken clock that's right twice a day.
Yeah, the situation in North Carolina is particularly because it's so bizarre. Basically, they're asking for a law that would permit a man to put on a wig and walk into a women's locker room, or a bathroom. And North Carolina just passed laws saying, this is places of public accommodation don't have to tolerate such things. And then all of a sudden now all the media, celebrities, and I think Google or PayPal decided not to locate to this state. And
yeah, the funniest thing I saw is that some porn site is going to boycott North Carolina. Can you imagine? The oligarch in charge of this is going to call, "You idiot! What do you think pornography is? It's a form of control. Turn on the switches in North Carolina again, you idiot."
But the way it's being portrayed in the media, but what happened is they're going to pound this in the media, and before too long, most people will be against North Carolina because of the law. Even though if you spell it out to most people, explain to them that the way the law reads, the places of public accommodation cannot discriminate against transgendered individuals. What they're saying is that on any given day, a man can decide to define himself as a woman that day and walk into a woman's locker room or bathroom and not be charged with anything. And it's never spelled out that way, but that's basically how these things go.
No, it's prima facie absurd.
Yes,
the whole thing is absurd. It only makes sense if you understand it the way I described it. Basically, is the oligarchs are now drunk with power, and they're not going to let some redneck from one of these provinces tell them what to do.
Yeah, that's the understanding. Somehow, this southern state is some sort of backward, benighted.
Of course, they're backward. They oppose transgendered people. That's the definition of backward, isn't it? Of course, they think that they elect representatives who have the power to pass laws. Well, that shows you how backward they are.
Well, that's the point you make is both in Indiana and I think 14 or 15 states passed laws explicitly banning so-called gay marriage. Then the federal courts step in and declared it a right.
Right.
With the most dubious reading of the Constitution. So I don't know.
Yeah, let's look at the positive side. What we're seeing here is oligarchy revealing all of its ugliness to large numbers of people. Mm-hmm. What the rigged upcoming Republican convention is going to be an educational experience for large numbers of people in this country.
Yeah, well, disabuse them of the notion that actually their vote matters.
That's right. That's and that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
In the final analysis, it is a good thing because you can't address a problem until you accept reality.
That's right, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. So consciousness is going to triumph here. We will reach a new level of consciousness, and that's a good thing.
Well, again, this is a wonderful book. I read it. I've had time to digest it and think about it, and the Jewish revolutionary spirit and its impact on world history. The sequel is Barren Metal. If
you have questions, write to me at jones@culturewars.com. I'll be happy to answer your question.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Jones, thank you for coming on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
And you have a wonderful night then.
Thank you.
Good night.